November 8, 2011. Two police officers in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, knock on apartment door number 25 in a crumbling Soviet-era building. They're investigating a cemetery vandalism report. Routine. Nothing unusual. Just another day on patrol in Russia's fifth-largest city. The man who answers the door is 45 years old, disheveled, wearing dark, heavy clothing despite the indoor heating. His eyes dart nervously between the officers, but he seems cooperative enough. "We'd like to ask you some questions about the local cemeteries," one officer says. "May we come in?" Anatoly hesitates. His hand grips the doorframe. Then, slowly, he steps aside. "Of course," he says. "But please, be respectful. My family is resting. What they found in the next room would haunt them for the rest of their lives." One officer would resign from the force within 6 months, unable to sleep, unable to forget. The other required psychiatric counseling for 2 years. And the lead investigator, when asked about the scene years later, could only manage to say, "Nothing in my 23-year career as a police officer prepared me for that apartment." The apartment was dark, heavy curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun. There was a smell in the air, something chemical, like preservation fluid, mixed with something organic underneath it. Not overwhelming, but present. Unmistakable once you noticed it. And in the dim light filtering through the doorway, they saw dolls. Dozens of dolls, life-sized, arranged carefully around the room, some sitting upright in chairs, others propped against walls, all dressed in elaborate clothing, vintage dresses from different eras, wigs styled carefully, makeup applied with disturbing precision. But something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. The faces weren't plastic, the proportions weren't quite human. And when one officer stepped closer, when his flashlight beam hit one of the figures directly, he realized what he was looking at. The skin was leather-like, mummified. The hands were skeletal, wrapped in cloth, and beneath the wig he could see actual skull bone. These weren't dolls. These were corpses. The mummified remains of children and young women, dressed and positioned and arranged like guests at a macabre family gathering in a madman's living room. And sitting calmly in the corner, watching the officers with an expression of mild concern, was Anatoly Moskvin. "Please don't disturb them," he said quietly. "They're sleeping." Welcome back to our 3-part investigation into Anatoly Moskvin. And this is True Crime Buff HQ. In Part 1, we traced Anatoly's 33-year psychological deterioration in comprehensive detail. We started with that traumatic moment at age 7, forced to kiss a dead girl's forehead at a funeral. We followed him through decades of obsessive cemetery visits, through the gradual erosion of his grip on reality, through the crystallization of his delusions, all the way to his first exhumation in 2006. Part 2. What you're watching right now covers the crimes themselves. From 2006 to 2011, what Anatoly did in the darkness of Russian nights. What he created in his apartment over 5 years, how he maintained a double life, and how the case was finally broken by a mother's grief and a detective's persistence. But I need to be absolutely clear about something. This episode is significantly more disturbing than Part 1. What Anatoly Moskvin did to the deceased, what he did to their families, what he created in that apartment, it's almost incomprehensible. We'll handle it with clinical precision and respect for the victims. But the facts themselves are horrifying. If you're not ready for this level of detail, Part 3 covers the trial and psychological aftermath without the graphic crime specifics. There's no shame in choosing that path. But if you want to understand the full scope of this case, if you want to see what unchecked mental illness and decades of untreated delusion can create when allowed to progress without intervention, then stay with me. Because what happened between 2006 and 2011 in the cemeteries and apartment of Nizhny Novgorod will redefine what you think is possible in human psychology. It will challenge your understanding of mental illness, of delusion, of the human capacity for self-deception. And it will show you why early intervention in childhood trauma is not just important. It's essential. Spring 2006. Anatoly Moskvin is now 40 years old. For 3 decades, more than 3/4 of his life, he's been visiting cemeteries. He's photographed thousands upon thousands of graves. He's attended hundreds of funerals of complete strangers. He's collected soil samples, gravestone rubbings, and cemetery artifacts. He's filled 60 journals with observations, thoughts, and increasingly disturbing delusions. But for 30 years, despite all the obsession, despite all the ritualistic behavior, despite the voices he claimed to hear calling to him from the graves, he's never crossed one final line. Until now. According to his later confession, corroborated by investigators' timeline reconstruction and forensic evidence, sometime in late April or early May 2006, Anatoly visited the Lermontovsky Cemetery in Nizhny Novgorod. Not during visiting hours, not during the day. At 2 a.m. in complete darkness. He'd been to this cemetery hundreds of times before. He knew it intimately. He knew the security patterns, the single guard who made rounds every 2 hours. He knew which sections had lighting and which were shrouded in darkness. He knew which graves were visited regularly by families and which had been forgotten, abandoned to time and neglect. And over the previous months, he'd selected a specific grave, a 10-year-old girl named Olga Chardimova, who had died in a car accident in '99, 7 years earlier. Why her specifically? According to the psychiatric evaluations conducted after his arrest, Anatoly believed he could hear certain graves calling to him. Not metaphorically. He genuinely believed he received auditory signals from specific graves, graves of girls who died young, who he was convinced were suffering in profound loneliness underground, trapped in darkness, forgotten by their families. His delusion had progressed to the point where exhumation wasn't desecration in his mind. It was rescue, it was mercy. It was fulfilling a sacred duty that only he could hear, only he could understand, only he could perform. This is the final stage before action in delusional disorders, when the delusion becomes directive, commanding, impossible to resist. I'm not going to describe the physical act of exhumation in graphic detail. That would be gratuitous and disrespectful to Olga's memory and her family's trauma. But to understand the scope and methodology of what came next, to understand how this became a 5-year pattern involving at least 26 confirmed victims, you need to understand one critical fact. Anatoly came prepared. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a sudden psychotic break where he acted without planning. This was methodical, calculated, rehearsed in his mind for months. He brought specific equipment, a military-style folding shovel, compact, efficient, designed for digging in confined spaces plastic sheeting, heavy-duty to wrap and transport remains, multiple garbage bags to contain materials and minimize evidence thickwork, gloves to protect his hands and avoid leaving fingerprints, a flashlight with a red lens. Red light is less visible from a distance, a technique he'd researched. He worked for approximately 3 hours. The grave was relatively shallow. Russian Orthodox burial tradition typically places coffins about 4 feet deep, not the 6 feet common in Western countries. The coffin itself was partially deteriorated from 7 years in the ground, the wood soft and yielding, and when he finally opened it, when he saw the partially decomposed, partially mummified remains of a child. Instead of horror, instead of the normal human revulsion that should accompany confronting death in this visceral way, Anatoly felt in his own words recorded during police interrogation. Relief, like a weight lifting off my chest, like I was finally doing what I was meant to do, what I was born to do. This reaction, feeling purposeful and relieved rather than horrified, is perhaps the clearest evidence of his complete psychotic break from reality. A person with intact reality testing, with normal emotional responses, with functioning empathy, cannot dig up a child's corpse and feel relief, cannot see decomposed human remains and feel satisfaction. His delusion had entirely replaced his normal human emotional architecture. The pathways in his brain that should have triggered revulsion, horror, guilt, they'd been rewired over 33 years to trigger satisfaction, purpose, even joy. This is what untreated trauma combined with progressive mental illness looks like at its most severe stage. Anatoly carefully removed the remains from the coffin. He wrapped everything meticulously in the plastic sheeting. He used the cemetery's own wheelbarrow, left by groundskeepers, to transport the wrapped bundle to the cemetery entrance. His parents lived just 2 kilometers away, in the same apartment building where Anatoly had his own small flat. It was 4:30 a.m. They were asleep. The streets were empty. He saw no one. He carried the bundle up 3 flights of stairs, into his locked apartment, into his locked room, and once there, with the door secured with heavy curtains blocking any view from outside, he began what he called restoration. Over the next several weeks, Anatoly engaged in a process he'd been researching for years. He cleaned the skeletal remains using various chemicals, some purchased from medical supply stores under the guise of academic research, others household cleaning products repurposed for this horrifying task. He studied mummification techniques, ancient Egyptian methods, modern embalming procedures, taxidermy preservation, pulling from every source he could find. He applied his own amateur preservation methods, attempting to halt further decomposition and create what he saw as a stable state. And then he began creating what he called a reconstruction, using materials he'd been stockpiling for months. Fabric, stuffing, clothing, wigs, makeup. Now, I need to make something absolutely clear, because this distinction matters for understanding both the psychology and the legal case that would follow. Forensic psychiatrists who evaluated Moskvin, who examined all physical evidence, who conducted DNA testing on all remains, testified conclusively that Moskvin's actions were not necrophilic in the traditional sexual sense. DNA evidence confirmed no sexual contact with any remains, no evidence of sexual motivation, no pornographic materials found, no sexual content in his journals. Instead, his delusion had convinced him he was resurrecting or restoring the deceased to a form where they could live with him, where they would no longer be lonely, where they could become part of his family. This doesn't make it less horrifying. Let me be absolutely clear about that. This doesn't reduce the violation, doesn't minimize the trauma to families, doesn't lessen the severity of his crimes. But it's psychologically distinct from typical necrophilia cases. And that distinction mattered for understanding what came next. Because his delusion wasn't about sexual gratification. It was about creating a family, about rescuing the forgotten, about fulfilling what he saw as a sacred mission, which meant he wasn't going to stop at one victim. What Anatoly created, he called his dolls. What investigators eventually found were life-sized figures constructed through a disturbing process. The mummified skeletal remains formed the core structure, the literal bones of the deceased serving as an internal frame. He added fabric and stuffing around the bones to create body shape, to make the figures appear more lifelike, to approximate human proportions. He dressed them in vintage clothing purchased from flea markets and second-hand stores, children's dresses from different eras, carefully selected to match what he imagined were each girl's personalities. He added wigs, sometimes made from human hair he purchased, sometimes using hair from the deceased themselves if enough remained intact. He created or purchased ceramic and plastic masks to serve as faces, painting them with makeup, giving each one distinct features, individual expressions. And then came the most disturbing part, the part that revealed just how deep his delusion went. He would position them carefully in his room, sitting in chairs arranged around a small table, propped against walls, placed near the window so they could see outside. He named each one. He wrote detailed biographies in his journals, inventing personalities, preferences, histories. He convinced himself he knew their favorite colors, their favorite foods, their dreams and fears, and he would interact with them daily. He would greet them each morning, hold one-sided conversations, include them in his routine, set places for them at his table during meals, actually placing food in front of the corpses. He created elaborate backstories about how he'd saved each one, about how grateful they were, about how they loved him like a father. His parents lived in the apartment directly below, just 15 feet beneath where he slept, where he ate, where he lived, surrounded by the corpses of 26 children. For 5 years, they had no idea. For 5 years, while they worried about their eccentric but harmless son, while they made him dinner and asked about his day, he was living with the dead. Between 2006 and 2011, across 5 years, Anatoly established a precise, methodical pattern that would eventually help investigators understand the full scope of his crimes. Target selection. He always chose girls or young women, never males. Ages ranged from 3 years old to 25, but most were between 8 and 15 at the time of death. He typically selected victims who had died within the past 5 to 15 years, recent enough that remains would be relatively intact, old enough that family visits might have decreased. He targeted graves in less visited sections of cemeteries, areas that had fallen into neglect, corners that security patrols rarely checked. He often chose graves of families who had moved away or stopped visiting regularly. He could identify these by the lack of fresh flowers, by overgrown weeds, by weathered headstones without recent cleaning. He never, ever touched graves that showed signs of regular maintenance. Fresh flowers meant family attention, meant risk. Methodology. He always worked between midnight and 5 a.m., during the deepest darkness when even insomniacs were asleep. He preferred moonless nights. He even tracked lunar cycles in his journals, planning exhumations around optimal darkness. He never targeted the same cemetery twice in a row. He rotated through different locations to avoid pattern recognition. He would wait weeks or months between exhumations, allowing any potential investigations to go cold before striking again. And critically, he carefully restored each gravesite after exhumation, filling in the earth, replacing grass, concealing any signs of disturbance. This is why he went undetected for so long. The cemeteries he targeted across the Nizhny Novgorod region included Lermontovsky Cemetery, Krasnaya Etna Cemetery, Bugrovskoye Cemetery, Myza Cemetery. Over 5 years, investigators would eventually confirm at least 26 victims. 26 families violated, 26 graves desecrated. But here's what keeps investigators awake at night. Moskvin's own journals reference more than 40 names. 40 girls he claimed to have rescued. 40 potential victims. Some of those graves were never identified. Some of those girls were never found. The full scope of his crimes may never be known. And at least 15 others spread across the wider region. Here's what makes this case even more disturbing, even more difficult to comprehend. While Anatoly was committing these crimes, while he was living with corpses, while he was desecrating graves in the dead of night, he was still functioning in public life. Not just functioning, excelling. Between 2006 and 2011, the same years he committed his crimes, Anatoly continued writing articles for local newspapers. His specialty pieces on local history and cemetery culture were actually popular, well regarded. Gave public lectures on cemetery history and funerary practices to historical societies, to universities, to anyone who would listen. People found him fascinating, if odd. Attended academic conferences on Slavic burial traditions, sometimes even presenting papers on the cultural significance of grave markers and memorial practices. Was regularly interviewed by journalists as a local expert on historical matters. He appeared on radio programs, in newspaper features, always articulate and knowledgeable. Published papers in academic journals on death rituals and cemetery preservation. Some of his work was even cited by other researchers. People knew him throughout Nizhny Novgorod, the eccentric cemetery expert, the brilliant local historian. Strange, certainly. Socially awkward, absolutely. But dangerous? No one suspected. No one. A former colleague, speaking anonymously to journalists after the arrest, said something that captures the cognitive dissonance perfectly. He was strange, yes, but strange in that way brilliant people often are, you know? He could speak for hours about gravestone inscriptions in a way that made them actually interesting. He knew cemetery layouts across the entire region from memory. Looking back now, of course, the obsession was obvious. But at the time, we all just thought he was passionate about his research. Dedicated. How were we supposed to know? How were we supposed to imagine that someone who spoke so respectfully about the dead, who seemed to care so much about preserving their memory, how were we supposed to know he was living with their corpses? But inside his apartment, slow down, Anatoly was living in a completely different reality. A reality divorced entirely from the world outside his door. According to his detailed journals, over 60 notebooks recovered during the investigation, spanning 30 years, but with the most disturbing entries from 2006 onwards, he had created an entire delusional world with its own internal logic, its own rules, its own bizarre coherence. The family. Delusion. He didn't see the corpses as corpses. He saw them as his daughters, and sometimes his brides. Language that was romantic, but, psychiatrists noted, not sexual. It was the language of Victorian Gothic literature, of fairy tales, of ancient myths about death and resurrection. He assigned each one a complete personality, shy or outgoing, serious or playful, artistic or scientific. He wrote pages and pages about their supposed preferences. He created elaborate backstories about their lives before death, not just copying their actual biographical details from headstones, but inventing entire personalities, childhood memories that never existed, dreams they never had. He believed they could communicate with him through dreams. He'd wake up and immediately journal about conversations he'd had during sleep, recording what each daughter supposedly told him. He celebrated their birthdays with small rituals, buying cakes he would then eat himself, lighting candles, singing songs to corpses propped up in chairs around his apartment. But inside his apartment, Anatoly was living in a completely different reality. A reality divorced entirely from the world outside his door. According to his detailed journals, over 60 notebooks recovered during the investigation, spanning 30 years, but with the most disturbing entries from 2006 onwards, he had created an entire delusional world with its own internal logic, its own rules, its own bizarre coherence. The family. Delusion. He didn't see the corpses as corpses. He saw them as his daughters and sometimes his brides. Language that was romantic, but, psychiatrists noted, not sexual. It was the language of Victorian Gothic literature, of fairy tales, of ancient myths about death and resurrection. He assigned each one a complete personality, shy or outgoing, serious or playful, artistic or scientific. He wrote pages and pages about their supposed preferences. He created elaborate backstories about their lives before death, not just copying their actual biographical details from headstones, but inventing entire personalities, childhood memories that never existed, dreams they never had. He believed they could communicate with him through dreams. He'd wake up and immediately journal about conversations he'd had during sleep, recording what each daughter supposedly told him. He celebrated their birthdays with small rituals, buying cakes he would then eat himself, lighting candles, singing songs to corpses propped up in chairs around his apartment. Daily routine. Every morning, he would greet them, walking around the room, addressing each by name, commenting on how they looked that day. He changed their clothing seasonally. Winter dresses when it was cold, lighter fabrics in summer, maintaining the delusion that they needed to be comfortable. He rearranged their positions regularly, moving them to different chairs, turning them to face different directions, as if they had agency, as if they had preferences about where they sat. He wrote letters to them in his journals, long, detailed letters expressing his love, his commitment to caring for them, his gratitude that they chose to stay with him. He created artwork depicting them, drawings and paintings showing them as living, breathing girls, playing, laughing, always happy in his care. The delusion deepens. By 2009, 3 years into his crimes, Moskvin's journals show he was documenting detailed conversations with the corpses, not just dream communications anymore, but daytime interactions he believed were real. He convinced himself they were happy living with him, that they preferred his apartment to their graves, that they were grateful for his rescue. He created increasingly elaborate backstories about rescuing each one from loneliness and darkness. Each exhumation became, in his fractured mind, a heroic act. His journals show complete, unwavering conviction that he was performing acts of profound mercy and love. Dr. Vladimir Yakovlev, the forensic psychiatrist who spent over 100 hours evaluating Moskvin after his arrest, provided expert testimony that perfectly captures the severity of his condition. This level of sustained, complex delusion, combined with maintained ability to function publicly and hold coherent conversations, represents one of the most challenging cases of compartmentalized psychosis I've encountered in 30 years of forensic psychiatry. He had essentially created two completely separate realities that existed simultaneously in his mind. One reality, the public one, where he was a functioning academic, eccentric but harmless. Another reality, the private one, where he was living with a family of reanimated corpses who loved him and needed his care, and he could switch between these realities seamlessly without apparent contradiction or cognitive dissonance. That's extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily severe. The question everyone asks, the question that haunted investigators, the question that torments Moskvin's parents to this day: how did they not know? Anatoly lived in his own small apartment in a building where his parents occupied another flat directly below. They saw him regularly, several times a week. They had meals together. They worried about him, about his lack of social life, about his obsessive interests. They knew he kept odd hours. They knew he was secretive. They knew something wasn't quite right, but they didn't know what was in his room. Here's why, and this isn't about excusing them. It's about understanding how someone can hide something this monstrous in plain sight. Physical barriers. Anatoly kept his apartment door locked at all times. His parents needed to knock and wait for him to answer, even though they lived in the same building. He never allowed anyone inside, including his parents. Not once in 5 years. If they needed to talk, they talked in the hallway or in their apartment. He used heavy blackout curtains to block all windows completely. His apartment was dark 24 hours a day, preventing any glimpse from outside. He burned incense constantly, thick, strong incense that masked any underlying odor of decay or preservation chemicals. He played music almost constantly when he was home, classical music, playing just loud enough to mask any sounds, any creaks, anything that might raise questions. Parental rationalization. When confronted about the locked door, I'm working on sensitive research materials that need to be protected. When asked about the chemical smell, preservation chemicals for old documents and photographs I'm studying. When questioned about his nocturnal schedule, the best time for cemetery photography is at dawn when the light is perfect. When they noticed he never invited anyone over. I prefer solitude for my work. You know how I am. And here's the heartbreaking part. His parents wanted to believe him. They needed to believe him. Parents of adult children with mental illness often engage in what psychologists call protective denial. They see warning signs but rationalize them, explain them away, convince themselves everything is okay because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. Cultural context. In post-Soviet Russia, especially in the generation of Moskvin's parents, certain cultural factors made intervention less likely. Privacy was sacred. Forcing yourself into an adult child's space was seen as disrespectful, even in the same building. Adult children living at home or near parents was common. It didn't signal dysfunction the way it might in Western cultures. Eccentricity in academics and intellectuals was not just accepted, but expected. Brilliant people are always strange, was the common wisdom. Mental health intervention was heavily stigmatized. Psychiatric treatment was associated with Soviet-era abuse, with forced hospitalization, with losing your rights and autonomy. After the arrest, Anatoly's mother gave one brief interview to a local journalist before she and her husband disappeared from public view completely. What she said haunts everyone who heard it. How do you process this? How do you understand that your son, who you raised from birth, who you loved unconditionally, who you thought you knew, how do you understand that he was living with dead children? That he was keeping corpses in his apartment like family members? How do you look in the mirror knowing you lived directly below that horror for 5 years? That you ate dinner with him, that you worried about him finding a job, that you encouraged his cemetery research. How do you live with that? I keep asking myself, what did I miss? What sign did I ignore? If I had just insisted on entering his apartment one time, just once, could I have stopped this? Could I have saved those families from this violation? She couldn't answer her own questions, and neither could investigators. Because the truth is, Moskvin was extraordinarily skilled at compartmentalization. He showed his parents exactly what he wanted them to see, nothing more. When police eventually seized Anatoly's belongings during the search of his apartment, they found over 60 journals spanning 30 years of his life. Some were academic in nature. Some were personal reflections. But the journals from 2006 to 2011, the crime years, are the most psychologically revealing and the most disturbing documents in the entire case file. Let me read you some excerpts. These have been edited slightly for clarity and translated from Russian, but I'm maintaining his language, his phrasing, his voice, because understanding how he thought is crucial to understanding how this happened. Olga is finally home with me. She was so cold in the ground, so alone in that dark coffin. I cleaned her carefully, respectfully, exactly as she deserved. It took me 3 days to properly prepare her, but I didn't mind. This is what I was meant to do. She will be beautiful again soon. She will have pretty dresses and soft hair, and she will never, ever be lonely again. I saved her. Finally, after all these years of visiting graves and feeling helpless, I actually saved someone. Today, I celebrated Natasha's birthday. She would have been 23 years old. I bought her a cake, chocolate, because I dreamed that she told me chocolate was her favorite. I placed it near her chair and sang happy birthday. She smiled at me in my dream last night. She thanked me for remembering her when her own family forgot. When I visited her grave before bringing her home, there were no flowers, no cards. No one had come in months. But I came. I always come, and now she's with me forever, and I make sure her birthday is celebrated every single year. I have 15 daughters now. My family is growing. Some people have biological children. I have rescued souls. Is there really a difference? They depend on me. If I die, who will care for them? Who will make sure they're dressed appropriately for the weather? Who will talk to them, keep them company, ensure they're never forgotten? This is my purpose. This is why I was born. Not everyone finds their purpose in life, but I have found mine. I am the keeper of the forgotten. I am the one who remembers. Sometimes I worry that people won't understand what I've done. They'll call me sick, evil, a monster, but they don't know what it's like to hear the voices of the forgotten dead. They don't understand the responsibility that comes with being the only one who listens, the only one who cares enough to act. These girls were abandoned by their families, left to rot underground in darkness and isolation. I gave them light. I gave them warmth. I gave them love. If there's a God, He will judge me fairly. He will see that I did what no one else would do. I saved them. These journal entries reveal something that's both fascinating from a clinical perspective and absolutely terrifying from a human one. Anatoly genuinely, completely, without any doubt or reservation, believed he was performing acts of rescue and mercy. His psychosis was so profound, so comprehensive, so total, that he had inverted all normal moral frameworks. Desecration became salvation in his mind. Violation became protection. Theft became rescue. Isolation in his apartment became freedom from loneliness. This is what untreated paranoid schizophrenia combined with necrophilic delusions looks like when allowed to progress completely unchecked for 33 years. There was no secret part of his mind that knew this was wrong. No guilty conscience lurking beneath the surface. No awareness whatsoever that he was committing horrific crimes. He had constructed an entire alternative moral universe where he was the hero, where he was the only person moral enough, brave enough, compassionate enough to do what needed to be done. And that delusion, that complete conviction in his own righteousness, would continue unchecked, unquestioned, absolute. Until a single mother, visiting her daughter's grave on a cold October morning in 2011, noticed something wrong. Something that would bring Anatoly Moskvin's 5-year nightmare to an end. October 23rd, 2011. A Sunday morning, cold but clear. A woman named Natalia Chardamova makes the drive from her new apartment in Dzerzhinsk, about 35 kilometers west of Nizhny Novgorod, to visit her daughter Olga's grave at Lermontovsky Cemetery. She doesn't come as often as she used to. The first few years after Olga died in that horrible car accident in '99, Natalia visited every week, sometimes twice a week. But it's been 12 years now. She's remarried. She has a young son. Life has pulled her forward, even as part of her remains forever frozen in that moment when police knocked on her door to tell her about the accident. Now she visits every few months. She brings flowers, white roses, Olga's favorite. She brings her grief, which hasn't diminished even after 12 years, only changed shape. And today, when she approaches the grave, something feels wrong. She can't identify it at first. The headstone looks fine, the plot hasn't been vandalized, but something is different. The earth has settled unevenly. There's a depression near the headstone that wasn't there before. Small cracks in the ground radiating out from the center, the grass growing in an irregular pattern. She kneels down, touches the earth. It feels loose, disturbed, like it's been dug up and filled back in. "Excuse me," she calls to the cemetery groundskeeper working nearby. "Something's wrong with my daughter's grave." The groundskeeper, a man named Yuri, who's worked at Lermontovsky for 15 years, comes over. He knows Natalia, recognizes her from her visits over the years. He examines the grave carefully, probes the earth with a metal rod he uses for various maintenance tasks. The rod sinks in much farther than it should. The earth is loose, recently disturbed, not properly settled. "I need to call the police," Yuri says quietly. "Someone's been digging here." The police arrive within an hour. They cordon off the area. By 3 p.m., they've begun a careful, official exhumation. And what they find will set off the largest cemetery desecration investigation in modern Russian history. The coffin is there, yes. It's damaged but intact. But when they open it, nothing. Empty. No remains. No body. Just disturbed earth at the bottom of the grave and an open, violated casket. Olga Chardamova, dead since '99, had been stolen from her resting place. Detective Mikhail Voronin caught the case. At 47 years old, with 22 years on the force, he'd seen a lot. Cemetery vandalism wasn't uncommon in Russia. Teenagers sometimes spray-painted headstones. Scrap metal thieves sometimes stole bronze plaques or iron fencing for resale value. But body theft? That was different. That was unprecedented in his experience. His first question was pragmatic. Was this isolated or part of a pattern? He began systematically checking other graves in Lermontovsky Cemetery, not just looking at them from a distance, but actually examining them closely, looking for uneven earth, checking for settlement patterns, probing the ground. And he found more. 3 more graves in Lermontovsky alone showed signs of disturbance. Subtle signs. These weren't crude, smash-and-grab robberies. These were careful, methodical excavations that had been concealed skillfully. Voronin expanded his search. He contacted groundskeepers at other cemeteries across Nizhny Novgorod and the surrounding region. "Check your graves," he told them, "especially older sections with fewer visitors. Look for settlement, irregular growth patterns, anything unusual." The reports started coming back within days. By November 1st, they had identified 8 confirmed desecrations across 4 different cemeteries. By November 5th, that number had grown to 16. Voronin realized he wasn't looking for a one-time crime of opportunity. He was looking for a serial cemetery desecrator who had been operating, undetected, for years. And then came the breakthrough that would crack the case wide open. A security camera at Bugrovsko Cemetery, recently installed after vandalism concerns earlier that year, had captured something on the night of October 15th, just 8 days before Natalia Chardamova discovered her daughter's violated grave. Grainy footage, black and white, timestamp reading 03:17 a.m. A figure moving between graves with a flashlight. Carrying bags. Crouching near specific plots. Working methodically for over 2 hours. The image quality was poor. Early 2000s security camera technology, nighttime recording, significant grain and noise. But it was enough. They had their suspect on camera. Now they just needed to figure out who he was. Detective Voronin took a methodical approach. He started building a profile. Who would have the knowledge to identify which graves were abandoned? Someone familiar with cemeteries. Someone who spent time there regularly. Who would have the skill to exhume bodies and conceal the disturbance? Someone with research skills. Someone methodical. Someone patient. Who would have the opportunity to work in multiple cemeteries across the region over several years? Someone with mobility, time, and no regular work schedule to restrict their movements. He began cross-referencing cemetery visitor logs. Many Russian cemeteries keep sign-in books for researchers and historians who want to document old graves. One name appeared repeatedly across multiple cemeteries spanning years: Anatoly Moskvin. He pulled Moskvin's records. No criminal history whatsoever. Not even a parking ticket. Currently unemployed but previously worked as a journalist and historian. Living with parents in Soviet-era apartment building. Known locally as an eccentric cemetery expert. Voronin interviewed people who knew Moskvin, cemetery administrators, fellow historians, former colleagues from his journalism days. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Strange but brilliant. Obsessed with death in an academic way. Could tell you anything about any cemetery in the region. Socially awkward but not threatening. Spent more time with the dead than the living. That last comment, from a cemetery groundskeeper, stuck in Voronin's mind. On November 7th, he obtained a photograph of Moskvin from a local newspaper article about cemetery preservation. He compared it to stills from the security footage. The build was right. The height was right. The way the figure moved, methodical, unhurried, matched witness descriptions of Moskvin's personality. On November 8, 2011, Detective Voronin sent 2 officers to Moskvin's address to conduct a routine interview. Just ask him about the cemeteries, Voronin instructed. See how he responds. See if he gets nervous. If it's him, we'll bring him in for formal questioning. Those 2 officers expected a brief conversation with a potential witness who might have seen something during his cemetery visits. What they got was a crime scene that would make international headlines and haunt them for the rest of their careers. When Anatoly Moskvin opened his apartment door at approximately 2:45 p.m. on November 8, 2011, officers Dmitry Kulakov and Sergei Petrov immediately noticed something odd. The smell hit them first. Not overwhelming, actually quite subtle, but present. Unmistakable once you recognized it. Chemical preservatives, formaldehyde, the same smell you get in biology labs. Something organic underneath it. Not rotting exactly, more like leather. Old leather left too long in storage. And behind Moskvin, through the partially open door, complete darkness. Mid-afternoon on a clear day, and his apartment was pitch black inside. We'd like to ask you some questions about the local cemeteries, Kulakov said. May we come in? Moskvin's expression was difficult to read in the dim hallway light. He seemed nervous, certainly. His hands gripped the doorframe, but he nodded slowly and stepped aside. Please, he said quietly, but be respectful. My family is resting. Officer Dmitry Kulakov, now retired and living in a different city, gave extensive testimony about what happened next, what he saw, and I'm going to read his account exactly as he gave it, because his words capture something that photographs cannot, the visceral, immediate horror of that discovery. We stepped into the apartment. Anatoly turned on a single lamp. Not the overhead light, just a lamp in the corner that cast everything in dim, shadowy light. The main room was maybe 20 square meters, not large, and around that room, positioned carefully, these figures. At first, I swear this is true, for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, my brain told me they were dolls, large dolls, mannequins maybe, some kind of art project. They were sitting in chairs around a small table. Others were propped against the walls, all dressed elaborately. Vintage clothing, wigs, makeup, like they were prepared for a formal gathering. But something was wrong. The proportions weren't quite right. Too thin. Proportions that were human but not normal, not healthy. I stepped closer to one. It was in a chair facing the table, wearing a blue dress, a blonde wig, makeup on the face, rouge, lipstick, eyeshadow, applied heavily. And I saw the hands. They weren't mannequin hands. They were skeletal. Wrapped in some kind of cloth, but you could see the bone structure underneath. I looked at the face more closely. The makeup was on a mask of some kind. Ceramic, maybe. But behind the mask, I could see actual skull bone through gaps in the construction. And the wig, I saw that hair was growing from the wig, but also growing from beneath it. Real hair, growing from what looked like preserved scalp. That's when I understood. These weren't dolls. These weren't mannequins. These were corpses, mummified human remains, dressed up, arranged like a family gathering. I felt my stomach drop. I heard Sergei, my partner, make a sound. Not quite a yell, more like a choked gasp. I looked around the room quickly, trying to count. 22, 23, 24. I stopped counting. There were so many. Sergei was already on his radio. We need backup. We need forensics. We need everyone. I looked at Moskvin. He was sitting in a chair near the door, completely calm, watching us with this expression of mild concern, like we were guests who were being slightly rude. And he said, "I'll never forget this." His voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact. He said, "They're not dolls. They're my family. Please don't disturb them. They're sleeping." When the forensic team arrived 2 hours later, when the apartment was flooded with lights and cameras and investigators wearing protective equipment, they began the horrifying task of cataloging what Anatoly Moskvin had created over 5 years. The final official inventory included 26 mummified bodies in various states of what Moskvin called reconstruction, some nearly skeletal, others more preserved through his amateur mummification attempts, all female, ages at time of death ranging from 3 years old to 25, though most were between 8 and 15. Some had been dead for 3 years. Others had been dead for more than 12 years. Every one of them stolen from their graves in the darkness. Elaborate clothing on every figure, vintage dresses from different eras, carefully selected and fitted. Some clothing was children's sizes, some was adult, all was meticulously maintained. Wigs on most figures, blonde, brunette, red, different styles. Some synthetic, some made from real human hair. Makeup applications, rouge, lipstick, eyeshadow, applied to ceramic or plastic masks that served as faces. Tags attached to each figure, handwritten tags with names and birth dates, like labels in a museum. Journals, over 60 notebooks documenting his thoughts, his process, his delusions, each acquisition. Maps of cemeteries with specific graves marked, some with notes about security patterns and optimal timing, preservation chemicals, formaldehyde, alcohol, various other compounds, some commercial, some homemade mixtures. Tools, shovels, plastic sheeting, bags, gloves, everything needed for exhumation and transport. Thousands of photographs of graves, organized meticulously in albums, some photos going back decades. Dr. Elena Shishkina, the forensic anthropologist assigned to the case, had perhaps the most difficult job in the entire investigation. She had to identify the remains. Some bodies were nearly skeletal, she said in later testimony. Others had tissue preserved through Moskvin's amateur mummification attempts, not preserved well, but preserved enough to make identification challenging. Each one had to be carefully documented. Photographed from every angle. Dental records when possible. DNA when dental records weren't available. Clothing sometimes helped. Families could sometimes identify specific dresses or jewelry. It took us 8 months to identify all 26 confirmed victims. Some families found out their loved ones' graves had been violated months after Moskvin's arrest. Imagine getting that phone call. "We need you to come to the police station. We need to talk about your daughter's remains." But here's the detail that made investigators realize the absolute depths of Moskvin's delusion. Among the evidence, they found letters. Handwritten letters addressed to each corpse, letters expressing his love for them, his gratitude that they stayed with him, his promise to always care for them, his belief that they were happy in his apartment, and some of those letters were dated within a week of his arrest. He was still writing love letters to corpses days before police knocked on his door. He was still actively, completely engaged in the delusion, convinced his family loved him, needed him, wanted to be with him, right up until the moment reality came crashing in. Anatoly Moskvin was arrested at the scene and transported immediately to Nizhny Novgorod Police Department headquarters. No handcuffs needed. He was cooperative. Calm. Almost eerily calm. He sat in the interrogation room, accepted water when offered, declined a lawyer initially. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said. "Why would I need a lawyer?" Detective Voronin conducted the initial interrogation. The footage, portions of which were released during the trial, shows something profoundly disturbing. A man with absolutely no comprehension that he'd committed crimes. Let me walk you through some key exchanges from that interrogation. Detective Voronin: "Mr. Moskvin, do you understand why you've been arrested?" Moskvin: "I assume it's about the girls in my apartment. But I don't understand why this is a legal matter. I rescued them." Voronin: "Rescued them from what?" Moskvin: "From loneliness. From being forgotten underground in darkness. Their families abandoned them. Most of those graves hadn't been visited in years. No flowers, no maintenance. They were alone." Voronin: "So you dug up their graves, you took their remains." Moskvin: "I didn't take them, I rescued them. There's a difference. Taking suggests theft. This was salvation." Voronin: "You desecrated graves. You stole human remains from burial sites. Those are serious crimes." Moskvin: "Desecrated? How is that desecration? I honored them. I cleaned them carefully. I dressed them in beautiful clothing. I made sure they were never alone, never forgotten. I gave them more respect than their own families did." Voronin: "Their families buried them. They mourned them. They visit their graves." Moskvin: "Some families, not all. Many of the graves I selected hadn't been visited in years. I could tell by the condition of the plots. Those girls were forgotten, until I remembered them." Voronin: "The families will be devastated to learn their loved ones' remains were taken." Moskvin: "But I gave them back their daughters, not as corpses in the ground, but as family members, living with me, being cared for. How is that not better?" Detective Voronin later gave an interview where he tried to explain what it was like interrogating Moskvin. It was surreal. Talking to him was like talking to someone from a different universe where all the rules were inverted. He spoke about these corpses the way a devoted father speaks about his children. Genuine affection in his voice, pride, love even. There was zero awareness that he'd done anything wrong. Zero guilt, zero remorse. Just complete conviction that he was performing acts of love and mercy. And the disturbing thing, he was articulate, logical within his delusional framework. He could explain his reasoning coherently. It was just that his entire premise, that corpses need rescue from loneliness, was completely psychotic. Over 48 hours of interrogation, spread across November 8th, 9th, and 10th, Anatoly Moskvin provided what investigators would later call the most detailed confession in Russian criminal history. He didn't confess because he felt guilty. He confessed because he was proud. He wanted people to understand what he'd done. He wanted to explain his methodology. He wanted credit for the care and effort he'd put into each rescue. He detailed everything. Every single exhumation. Dates, locations, times, which cemetery, which section, which specific grave. His selection criteria, how he chose which graves, why certain girls called to him more strongly than others. His preservation and reconstruction methods, what chemicals he used, what techniques, what materials, showing investigators photographs of his process. His daily routines with the corpses, how he cared for them, talked to them, included them in his life. His complete delusional belief system, how he believed they communicated with him, how he was certain they were happy, how he saw himself as their savior. He showed investigators his maps, his journals, his photographs, his detailed documentation of 5 years of crimes. He walked them through his entire process step by step, with the pride of a craftsman explaining his work. And when asked, this is critical, when Detective Voronin asked if he understood he'd hurt people, if he understood the families of the deceased would be traumatized, Moskvin said something that perfectly encapsulated his complete psychotic break from reality. The families abandoned them. They left them underground to rot in darkness and isolation. I gave them light. I gave them company. I gave them a home. I gave them love. If anyone hurt those girls, it was their families who forgot them, who stopped visiting, who moved away and left them alone. I saved them from that abandonment. I'm the only one who cared enough to act. If God judges me, he will see the truth. He will see that I was merciful when no one else was. In Moskvin's fractured reality, he was the hero of this story. The families were the villains, neglectful, abandoning their dead daughters, and the corpses themselves. They were grateful, they loved him, they chose to stay with him. Nothing, not evidence, not testimony, not logic, not reality itself, could penetrate that delusion. When news of Anatoly Moskvin's arrest broke on November 10, 2011, Russia erupted. The case dominated every news channel. Newspapers ran front-page stories for weeks. International media picked it up. BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, every major outlet covered what was quickly being called Russia's most disturbing criminal case. Terms like the cemetery keeper and the doll maker became instantly associated with Nizhny Novgorod, a city of 1.2 million people suddenly infamous worldwide. But behind the sensational headlines, behind the media circus, there was real, profound, almost incomprehensible trauma. The families, 26 families, mothers, fathers, siblings, grandparents, suddenly learned that their loved ones' graves had been violated, that their daughters, their sisters, their granddaughters had been stolen and desecrated in ways almost too horrible to process. Many couldn't afford reburial costs. The city eventually set up a fund, but processing took months. Some graves remained empty for half a year, while families waited for remains to be released from evidence. The psychological devastation was immense. Grief counseling services were overwhelmed. Support groups formed specifically for the families of Moskvin's victims. Marina Volkova, whose 12-year-old daughter Yelena was among the 26 victims, gave a statement to the press that captured the collective trauma. I visited my daughter's grave every month for 8 years. Every month. I brought her favorite flowers. I told her about my life, about her brother growing up, about missing her. For 8 years, I talked to an empty grave. For 8 years, I believed my daughter was at peace, resting, somewhere beyond this pain, and the whole time, she wasn't even there. Some sick man had stolen her body, had her in his apartment, was dressing her up like a doll, was pretending she was his family. How do you process that? How do you mourn again? How do you ever feel that your loved one is finally at rest when they've been violated so profoundly? I can't visit her grave anymore. I physically cannot make myself go there. Because I know now that a grave means nothing, that it's not a sacred place, that people can just take what's buried there. He stole my daughter twice, once when he took her body, and again when he destroyed my ability to grieve properly. The Moskvin case presented enormous ethical challenges for media coverage, both in Russia and internationally. Some outlets published graphic details unnecessarily, describing the corpses in explicit terms, speculating about sexual elements that didn't exist, turning the case into horrific entertainment. Some showed crime scene photos that should never have been released, images of the corpses of Moskvin's apartment, violating the dignity of the deceased all over again. Some turned Moskvin into a sensationalized monster without examining the systemic failures, without discussing mental health, without providing context or education. Others, and this is what we're attempting here at True Crime Buff HQ, tried to balance public interest with respect for victims, tried to educate without exploiting, tried to explain without glorifying. Investigative journalist Irina Gordeeva, who covered the case for Novaya Gazeta, wrote an editorial that addressed this tension directly. We had a responsibility to report this case. The public deserved to know what happened. The families deserved to have their trauma acknowledged. But we also had a responsibility not to further violate these families, not to turn their daughters into objects of morbid curiosity, not to describe the corpses in graphic detail that serves no educational purpose. The line between informing the public and exploiting tragedy is thin. Too many outlets crossed it. They showed photos that shouldn't exist. They used language designed to shock rather than inform. They focused on the horror instead of the humanity. We failed many of these families twice. Once by not noticing Moskvin's mental illness earlier, and again by how we covered his crimes. This is why content warnings matter, why clinical language matters, why we don't show graphic images or provide unnecessary details. The goal isn't shock value. The goal isn't entertainment at the expense of victims. The goal is understanding. Understanding how this happened. Understanding what warning signs were missed. Understanding how childhood trauma combined with untreated mental illness can create tragedies like this. Understanding so we can prevent it from happening again. Anatoly Moskvin was charged with 26 counts of desecrating human remains. Under Russian criminal law at the time, he faced up to 5 years in prison per count, a maximum theoretical sentence of 130 years. But almost immediately, legal questions arose that would dominate the case. Could he even stand trial? Was he mentally competent to understand the charges against him? Did he comprehend right from wrong? Could he assist in his own defense? The prosecution wanted punishment. Maximum sentences. Justice for the families. The defense wanted psychiatric hospitalization. Treatment, not imprisonment. And the families wanted answers that neither punishment nor treatment could provide. In Part 3, dropping on Saturday, 21st of November 2025, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll cover the trial that consumed Russia for months. The extensive psychiatric evaluations that revealed the full depth of Moskvin's mental illness. The legal battles over competency, responsibility, and whether someone in a complete psychotic state can be held criminally accountable. And the question everyone's asking: where is Anatoly Moskvin today? Is he still detained? Is he receiving treatment? Could he possibly, conceivably, ever be released back into society? And most disturbingly, has he shown any remorse? Any understanding of what he's done? Any break from the delusion? The answers will surprise you, and they'll challenge everything you think you know about justice, mental illness, and whether our legal systems are equipped to handle cases this complex. Because the trial revealed something no one expected. Something that changed the entire trajectory of the case. Something that's still causing controversy in Russia today, more than a decade later. Part 3 drops on Saturday, 21st of November 2025, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Subscribe, turn on notifications, watch other true crime documentaries showing on your screen right now. Thank you. Before we end, I need to say something that matters more than anything else in this video. This case isn't about Anatoly Moskvin. It never was. This case is about 26 young women and girls whose deaths were violated, whose families were traumatized beyond measure, whose dignity was stolen along with their remains. This case is about Olga Chardimova, Marina Volkova's daughter Yelena, Natasha, and 23 others whose names deserve to be remembered with respect, not associated with horror. If this content has affected you, and I would be concerned if it didn't, mental health resources are linked in the description below. If you or someone you know is struggling with obsessive thoughts about death, with trauma that won't heal, with delusions or hallucinations, please seek professional help immediately. Early intervention saves lives. Treatment exists. You are not alone. Subscribe for part 3 of this series. Like this video to help others understand this case in an educational, respectful way. Share it if you believe this kind of psychological analysis matters. And remember, these stories matter not for shock value, not for entertainment, but because understanding how these tragedies occur is the first step toward preventing them. This is True Crime Buff HQ. Thank you for watching with the gravity this case deserves. I'll see you in part 3.